She didn't scream. That's the thing no one tells you about real heartbreak. There's no dramatic collapse. No gasping sob. No moment where you sink dramatically to the floor and the world slows down around you like a movie. No, it's quiet. It's the kind of quiet that fills your chest like cold water, rising slowly, steadily, until you realize you've stopped breathing. Until you realize that the sound you keep hearing isn't your own heartbeat anymore. It's the sound of something ending. She stood in the doorway of a room she had paid half the rent for, holding a paper bag of warm takeout. His favorite order, extra chili, no onions, and she watched. She watched the woman whose laugh she had heard through the wall 3 times in the last month. She watched the man who had whispered, "I love you," against her hair just this morning. And she stood very, very still. The bag crinkled. Just once. Just the smallest sound. He turned. And in his eyes, before the guilt, before the panic, before the scramble of excuses that would follow, she saw something that cut her more cleanly than any lie ever could. Relief. Relief that it was finally over. That the secret had finally found its way out. She set the bag down on the floor, carefully, like it mattered, like maintaining that one small act of control was the only thing keeping her together. And she walked back out. Before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel is where stories like this live. Stories about survival, pain, love, and the kind of healing that doesn't happen overnight. If that speaks to you, subscribe right now and ring that bell. Because I promise, what's coming next will stay with you long after it ends. She didn't cry until she was in the elevator. And even then, it was only 2 tears. 2 quiet, furious tears that she wiped away before the doors opened and she stepped back into the ordinary world. Her name was Zara. 24 years old. Biology degree she hadn't used yet. Part-time job at a medical research office that she'd taken because it paid well and she liked the precision of it. She had a plant named Gerald that she talked to when she was stressed. She made her own chai from scratch because her mother had taught her how. She was not a girl who fell apart. She was, however, a girl who had just discovered that the person she had trusted most in the world had been lying to her for, based on the comfort level she had witnessed in that room, at least 3 months. She called her best friend, Amara, and said 4 words. It was the neighbor. Amara, who was eating dinner at the time, put her fork down. "I'm coming over." "Don't. Zara. I need 1 night. Just 1 night." Silence. And then, because Amara knew her better than almost anyone, she said, "Okay, but I'm calling at 8 tomorrow morning, and if you don't answer, I'm using the spare key." "Fine." She hung up. She sat on the floor of her apartment. Not because she collapsed. Because she chose to. Because sitting on the floor felt more honest than sitting on the couch where she and Damien had watched movies. Where she had leaned her head on his shoulder and thought, with that soft, private certainty that people only ever feel before it's taken from them. Asterisk, this is enough. This is exactly enough. Asterisk. The betrayal wasn't just about Damien. That was the part that took her a while to understand. The betrayal was about all the small choices she had made, all the moments she had pushed aside the tiny, nagging feeling that something was off. The late returns. The locked phone. The way he laughed a little too quickly whenever she mentioned the neighbor. She had chosen not to see. And now she had to live with the fact that she had helped build the lie. She sat there for a long time. Outside, the city moved the way cities always do. Indifferent, tireless, full of other people living other stories. And somewhere beneath the hum of traffic and the distant bark of a dog, she thought she heard something. Low, rhythmic, like a pulse from somewhere very far away. She didn't think anything of it. Not then. 3 days later, her mother called. She almost didn't answer. She was still in that fragile space where phone calls felt like too much presence from the outside world pressing against the glass she had built around herself. But her mother's name on the screen had a particular weight that Zara had never been able to ignore. She picked up. "Mama. My love." Her mother's voice was softer than usual. A little rough at the edges. "Can you come home this weekend?" Something in those words. Something careful and deliberate that made Zara sit up straighter. "Is everything okay?" A pause. 1 beat too long. "Come home. her mother said again. We'll talk when you're here. Zara drove home on Saturday morning. She arrived to find her father sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea. He clearly wasn't drinking. Her younger brother, Kofi, was nowhere in sight, which meant he'd been sent somewhere, which meant whatever was about to happen, they didn't want him to hear it. Her mother sat across from her father. She was thinner than the last time Zara had seen her. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough that Zara noticed and then immediately wished she hadn't noticed, because the moment you notice something like that, the clock starts ticking. What's wrong? Zara asked. Her parents exchanged a look. The kind that only people who have been married for decades can exchange. Entire conversations compressed into a single glance. Her father spoke. Your mother has been diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition. Early onset. The doctors say. He stopped. Cleared his throat. Tried again. The doctors say there is a treatment. Experimental. Expensive. Not covered by insurance. Zara looked at her mother. Her mother looked back at her with eyes that were steady and sad and entirely too calm. The eyes of a woman who had already done her grieving in private, who had already moved past the shock and into the quiet, practical acceptance of what needed to happen next. How expensive? Zara asked. The number her father named was not a real number. It was the kind of number that appears in conversations about tragedy, the kind that sounds like a misprint, like someone added an extra zero by mistake. But neither of them was laughing. There's something else, her mother said. And here it was. Zara could feel it, the real weight of the conversation pressing down on her shoulders like a hand. A man came to see us, her father said. His voice had changed. It was careful now. Too careful. A doctor. He works for a private medical institute. He said he'd heard about your mother's condition through a colleague. He said he had a solution. What kind of solution? A trial. Procedure. Completely experimental. Her father hesitated. He said he needed a specific kind of participant. Young. Healthy. Female. He said he'd cover all of your mother's treatment costs in exchange for participation. Zara went very still. What kind of participation? Another glance between her parents. Another loaded silence. He wasn't entirely specific, her mother said softly. He called it a genetic compatibility trial. He said it was safe. He said participants had gone through it before. He said. She paused. He said you were an ideal candidate. That he'd been looking for someone like you for a long time. Zara looked at her hands. Everything in her wanted to say no. Every rational, self-preserving instinct she had fired at once, like 100 small alarms going off in a building. But then she looked up at her mother. And her mother said very quietly, Zara, I'm not asking you to do this. I know. I would never. I know, Mama. She reached across the table and took her mother's hand. Felt the bones beneath the skin. Felt how fragile and irreplaceable that hand was. Thought about all the mornings she had watched those hands make breakfast, braid her hair, press against her forehead to check for fever, clap in the front row of every school performance Zara had ever been in. Tell me how to contact him, Zara said. The doctor's name was Harlan. He had a face built for reassurance. Soft features, a calm voice, reading glasses he didn't need. He met her in an office that was too clean to be a real office and too sterile to be comfortable. He explained the procedure with the practiced ease of someone who had explained it many times before. A cellular modification, a genetic compatibility test, a series of treatments over 48 hours. He showed her papers, waivers, consent forms printed on very expensive paper. What he did not explain, what the small print said in language so technical it would require a specialist to decode, was what she was actually agreeing to. He did not tell her about the pack. He did not tell her about the alpha. He did not tell her that the woman sitting across from him, sipping water and signing her name in careful loops at the bottom of each page, was not signing up for a medical trial. She was signing up to be changed. She was signing up to become something that had never existed before. A human woman made compatible with a world that was older and more dangerous than anything she could imagine. She went into the facility on a Tuesday. She remembered the room being very white. She remembered the cold four-line in her arm. She remembered thinking about Gerald, the plant, and hoping she'd remembered to water him before she left. And then pain. Not the kind of pain you prepare for. Not the clean, manageable pain of injury or illness that you can breathe through and count away. This was something else. This was the pain of rewriting, of being taken apart and put back together in a new configuration. Every nerve ending lighting up at once. Every cell in her body protesting, then adapting, then, over those long, burning hours, accepting. She heard sounds she couldn't identify, felt her own heartbeat change rhythm, felt something shift deep in her chest, low and resonant, like a second pulse settling in beside the first. She didn't know what it was. She would. When it was over, she lay in the white room and stared at the ceiling and breathed. In and out. Slowly. The pain was gone, but in its place was something else. A heightened awareness that she didn't have words for yet. The fluorescent light above her was too bright. The sound of footsteps down the hall was too loud. She could smell the cleaning products on the floor, the coffee in someone's cup 3 rooms away, the cold metal of the cart someone was rolling past her door. She turned her head. Harlan was standing by the door, and for the first time his face was different. The reassurance was gone. What replaced it was something she would only identify later as calculation. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Different," she said. He nodded. Made a note. "The transfer will happen tomorrow morning." She frowned. "Transfer? To the estate?" He looked at her over the top of his clipboard. "The terms of the agreement, Miss Adeyemi. You'll be briefed fully upon arrival." She sat up. "What estate? What terms?" "I agreed to a medical trial." "You agreed," he said, gently but precisely. "To a procedure in exchange for your mother's ongoing treatment. The procedure is complete. The rest of the arrangement begins tomorrow." He left before she could ask anything else. She lay back in the white room. The second pulse in her chest beat steadily. Patient. Like it had always been there and was simply waiting for her to notice it. Outside the window, somewhere very far away, something howled. They drove for 2 hours. She sat in the back of a black vehicle with tinted windows and watched the city disappear behind her and the landscape change. From highway to motorway to secondary road to something that barely deserved the word road at all. A rutted track through dense forest that went on longer than she expected. The man in the front passenger seat had not spoken since they left. The driver had not spoken at all. There was no music. No radio, just the sound of tires on gravel and the forest pressing in on either side. She had her phone. She had tried to call Amara twice. No signal. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched the trees. And then, between one breath and the next, she felt it. Presence. There was no other word for it. It wasn't a sound and it wasn't a sight. It was a feeling, the way the air feels just before a storm, when the pressure drops and everything goes very still and your skin prickles with the awareness that something enormous is about to happen. She sat up straighter. They broke through the treeline and the estate appeared. She had expected a compound. Something industrial, perhaps. Something that matched the clinical coldness of Harlan's office. What she found instead was something ancient. Stone walls that had been standing for centuries. Towers at each corner, worn smooth by weather. Iron gates that swung open as the car approached, as though someone had been watching and waiting. Inside the gates, a courtyard paved in dark stone, lit by torches even in the daylight, their flames burning low and orange in the gray afternoon. The main building was enormous. Arched windows, heavy doors, ivy that had grown so long and so deep it had become part of the structure, woven into the stone itself. She climbed out of the car. The air hit her differently here, richer somehow, layered with things she couldn't identify. Pine and rain and something older and earthier beneath both of those. Something that made the new, strange pulse in her chest quicken. A woman was waiting at the top of the stone steps. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in deep burgundy. She had the kind of face that had once been beautiful and had evolved, over decades, into something more powerful than beauty. Authority sharpened to a fine point. "Zara Adeyemi," the woman said. "Not a question. I am Elder Seraphine. I oversee the domestic arrangements of this estate. You will come with me. Not a question either. Zara had approximately 40 questions. She chose the most important one. Where am I? Seraphine looked at her for a moment. A measuring look, the kind that takes inventory. You are in the territory of the Ashvale Pack, she said. You are under the protection of this estate. You will come to no harm here, provided you honor the terms of your arrangement. I don't know the terms of my arrangement. You will. Seraphine turned and walked toward the doors. Come. They gave her a room. It was not what she expected. It was large and warm, with a fireplace already lit and curtains in a deep, dark green. A four-poster bed, a writing desk, a window seat that looked out over a garden that was, even in late autumn, carefully maintained. On the desk was a folder. She sat down and opened it. She read for a long time. When she finished, she set the folder down very carefully and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to feel everything that was rising inside her. The rage, the fear, the sense of profound betrayal, the grief, and underneath all of it, the terrible practical calculation of a person who has been put into an impossible position and is already, even in the midst of the storm, working out how to survive it. 3 minutes. Then she picked the folder back up and read it again. The terms were specific. She had been genetically modified to survive the transition between human and shifted biology, to carry, in simple terms, a child that was both. The procedure Harlan had performed was not a medical trial. It was preparation. She had been made compatible. The alpha of the Ashvale Pack required an heir. His counsel had required it for years. He had refused every arranged pairing, every offered mate. The council had taken a different approach. Find a human, prepare her, bring her in. The contract required 3 things of her. 1. She must remain on the estate for as long as it took. 2. She must bear the alpha's heir. 3. And this was the part that made her read the sentence 3 times to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. She must make the alpha choose her willingly. Not by force, not by command, not by the pack's authority, by his own free choice. Only then would the bond be recognized. Only then would the heir carry the full weight of alpha lineage. If she failed to achieve his willing choice, the contract remained open. Indefinitely, if she abandoned the estate, her mother's treatment would cease. Immediately, the cost of all treatments administered to date would become a debt called in full. And if she succeeded, if she achieved the heir and the willing bond, she would be free to go, with her mother's care secured for life, with a settlement that would ensure Zara herself would never have to worry about money again. She sat with this for a long time, and then she said very quietly to the empty room, "He doesn't know, does he?" She wasn't asking. She already knew the answer. The alpha didn't know there was a contract. He didn't know about the arrangement. He had been told, presumably, something else, or perhaps nothing at all, and she would simply be placed in his path and observed. She was supposed to make a man fall in love with her. A man who, according to one page of that folder, written in the careful, clinical language of someone who wanted to minimize its weight, had watched the woman he loved executed alongside his own brother for an act of betrayal. A man who had closed himself off so completely that an entire council had decided the only solution was to engineer his future rather than wait for him to choose it. She looked into the fire. She thought about her mother. She thought about Damien, about the relief she'd seen in his eyes. She thought about the way betrayal accumulates, the way it doesn't arrive all at once but builds, layer by layer, until the structure of your life that you thought was solid turns out to have been quietly hollowed out from underneath. She had been betrayed by a boyfriend, then by her own body's vulnerability, through her mother's illness, then by a doctor who had spoken the language of care while pursuing something entirely different. And now she was sitting in a room in a house full of werewolves, holding a contract that required her to make an emotionally destroyed alpha fall in love with her or spend the rest of her life in debt. She took a breath. She closed the folder. "Okay," she said quietly, not to anyone. Not even to herself, really, just to the room, just to the fire, just to whatever it was that kept insisting that she get back up, no matter how many times she was knocked down. Okay. She didn't meet him that first night. She met the pack instead, or rather, the pack's various opinions of her, delivered in a variety of ways. At dinner in the Great Hall, she sat at the end of a long table and felt 20 pairs of eyes calibrate her, measuring her worth, her resilience, her purpose. Some of those gazes were curious. Some were hostile. One, from a woman with copper hair and cold, precise eyes, was something more pointed than either. Her name, Zara would learn, was Lyra. She was the Alpha's beta, his second, and she had, until approximately 3 days ago when the council had announced the arrangement, believed she herself might one day be the one chosen. Zara ate her food quietly. She said little. She watched everything. She had learned this, the value of watching, in the first years of her biology degree, when a professor had told her that the most valuable skill in research wasn't analysis or intelligence. It was patience, the ability to observe without interfering, to let things reveal themselves rather than forcing the revelation. So she watched, and what she saw was a pack that was, beneath the surface of its collective cold shoulder, deeply, genuinely complicated. People who moved through the halls with the ease of long familiarity, who argued and laughed and carried private griefs with the particular weight of people who had seen real losses, who were united not by fear of their leader, though there was respect, unmistakable and absolute, but by something older and more animal than fear. Loyalty. She was finishing her tea when she heard the hall go quiet. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. It happened like a change in pressure, a gradual, collective shift in the room's attention toward the far doorway. Conversations didn't stop. Movements didn't freeze. But everything oriented, subtly and completely, toward the entrance. She turned. He was not what she expected. She had built a picture in her mind, sitting in her room reading that folder. She'd imagined someone who wore his power obviously, someone large and demonstrative, the kind of leader who fills a room with noise. The man in the doorway was none of that. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-complexioned, with the kind of stillness in his face that only comes from years of learning to keep things in. He wore dark clothing that gave nothing away. His eyes moved across the hall with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since learned to see everything in a single sweep. He was not looking for her, but he found her anyway. Their eyes met, and for exactly 3 seconds, he looked at her without expression, without surprise or displeasure or curiosity, just recognition, the way you recognize something you were expecting, even if you never said you were expecting it. Then he looked away. He moved to his seat at the head of the table and sat, and the hall's attention redistributed itself, and conversations resumed, and it was as though that moment had lasted no longer than a blink. But Zara sat very still, because in those 3 seconds, she had felt something. That second pulse in her chest, the one the procedure had left her with, the one that had been beating steadily and silently since the White Room, had lurched, just once. A single, hard beat, like a fist against a door. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. She stared at the table. She told herself it was nothing. His name was Kale. She learned it not from him. He had not spoken a single word to her that first evening, but from a young pack member named Soren who had been assigned, somewhat apologetically, as her informal guide through the estate's daily rhythms. Soren was 18, gangly, and almost entirely incapable of concealing his thoughts. He had been instructed, clearly, to answer her questions without volunteering information, and he was doing his absolute best, and failing approximately every 3 minutes. "The Alpha," she said, as they walked the garden path the following morning. "His name is Kale?" "Yes." Pause. "Alpha Kale Ashvale. Has he been Alpha long?" Soren's face did something complicated. "Since he was 26. So, 8 years. That's young." He was... Soren stopped himself, started again. He took the title young. It was... There were circumstances. She didn't push. Not yet. Instead she asked, "Does he often eat in the hall with everyone else?" "Every night." He thinks. Another pause. Another visible battle with the instruction not to volunteer things. He thinks it's important for the pack to see him. For him to see them. She considered this. The picture it painted was different from what the folder had implied. The folder had described a cold, self-contained leader who had withdrawn from emotional engagement following his loss. But a man who ate every night with his people and wanted them to see him, that was not a man who had given up on his responsibilities. That was a man who had separated love from leadership, who had decided that one could continue even when the other was sealed off. She found that quietly she understood that. "What does he do?" she asked. "During the day." Soren blinked. "What do you mean? What does he do with his time? What are his routines?" Soren looked at her with an expression that suggested this was not a question anyone had ever asked in his presence before. "He runs the territory in the morning, training at midday, council hours in the afternoon, correspondence in the evenings before dinner. He runs? Like, physically runs. The perimeter. Every morning. First light." Soren hesitated, then added, seemingly against his better judgment, "Alone." She nodded slowly. She filed that away. She encountered him properly on the third day. She was in the library, a room she had found by accident and immediately claimed as her primary sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling shelves, 3 fireplaces, and an almost comical excess of comfortable chairs, when the door opened. She heard him before she saw him. That second pulse in her chest announced him the way a compass announces north. Not loudly, but unmistakably. He stopped just inside the door. She looked up from her book. He looked at her with that same contained expression. No surprise, no pleasure, no displeasure. Just the quiet fact of her presence. Acknowledged. "You can use this room," he said. "I know," she said. "Seraphine gave me access." A pause. "I meant. Don't let me interrupt." She blinked. That was not what she expected him to say. He moved to the far side of the library, to a desk positioned under the window, and sat. Opened a file. Began working. She looked back at her book. She did not read a single word of the next 2 pages. The room held both of them in silence. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that has mass, that presses on the skin and asks questions. After a while, she heard him set down his pen. She didn't look up. "How are you adapting?" he asked. She turned the page. "Better than expected." A pause. "The modification leaves some people disoriented for weeks." "I've been disoriented longer than that," she said. "I'm used to it." Nothing. She risked a glance. He was watching her. Not studying her. Not with the obvious calculation she'd seen in Harlan's face or Lyra's cold assessment. Something quieter. Something that was trying very hard to look like nothing. "You weren't told the full truth before you came here," he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a question. She met his eyes. "No, neither was I," he said. The silence that followed had a different quality. She set down her book. "What were you told?" she asked. His jaw moved. A small tension quickly controlled. That the council had identified a compatible candidate. That the procedure had been completed. That she would arrive. He paused. "I was not told about the contract." She stared at him. "When did you find out?" "Yesterday morning." His voice was entirely flat. Controlled in the way of someone who has had a great deal of practice at it. "When Seraphine showed me the documentation. Yesterday morning." Which meant he had spent the entirety of last night's dinner knowing what she was there for. Knowing the terms, knowing she existed as a contractual instrument of his council's management of him. And he had still sat at the head of his hall and eaten his dinner and looked at her for exactly 3 seconds without expression. She felt a sudden, unexpected respect for that. For the discipline of it. "Are you angry?" she asked. "Yes." "At me?" The smallest pause. "No." She picked up her book again. "Good," she said quietly. They sat in the library for another hour. Neither spoke again. When he stood to leave, she heard him pause near the door. "Your mother's treatment," he said. "I've requested that it be transferred to the PAC's medical accounts, regardless of the contract's terms. It will not be used as a mechanism." She looked up. His back was to her. His hand was on the door. "Why?" she asked. He didn't turn around. "Because threatening a person through their sick parent is not how this PAC operates." And because whoever negotiated those terms will hear that from me directly. He left. She sat with the book in her lap and the fire crackling beside her and that second pulse beating quietly in her chest. And she thought about what it meant when the person you were supposed to trick into loving you turned out to be someone you might, given very different circumstances, actually want to know. If you've been listening from the beginning, welcome to The Pull. This story has its claws in you now, and I know it. Before we go deeper into the fire between Zara and Kale, take a second and share this with someone who needs to feel something today. Drop a comment. Tell me, are you Team Zara, or are you already falling for him too? And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is exactly the right time, because what happens next changes everything. She started waking at first light, not because she couldn't sleep. Surprisingly, on the estate, she slept deeply and dreamlessly, the new biology of her settling into the rhythms of the territory like a plant finding its root system. She woke early because the mornings here were something she had never experienced in the city. The light was different in the forest. It came in layers, gray first, then gold, then a clean, pale white that made the frosted grass look like something from another world. And in the earliest part of the morning, before the estate woke properly, there was a silence that had weight and texture, and movement. She stood at her window on the fourth morning and watched him run. Not a jog, not a workout, something more essential than that, the movement of a person for whom running was not exercise but expression. He disappeared into the trees at the edge of the estate garden, and she tracked the disturbance of birds and branches that followed his path, and she thought, he runs to feel something. Or he runs to stop feeling something. I'm not sure which. She started walking the garden at the same time. She told herself it was for the air. She did not tell herself why she chose the eastern path, the one that brought her around to the treeline just as the birds settled back and the forest exhaled and the figure in dark clothes emerged from between the pines. He saw her immediately. He always saw everything immediately. He slowed. Stopped. There was something in the lines of him that was different after running. The controlled stillness of his days was still there, but beneath it something looser, something that hadn't had time to reassemble itself back into its proper configuration. You're up early, he said. His breath made clouds in the cold air. So are you. I'm always up early. He looked at her. Do you normally walk in the mornings? She knew the honest answer. She gave it anyway. I've started to. Something crossed his face. Not a smile. She was beginning to understand that smiles were not a currency he spent easily, but something in the direction of acknowledgement. They walked back toward the estate without discussing whether they would or not. It happened 3 more times that week, and then it became a thing, unspoken, unacknowledged, but real. They walked the garden in the early cold, occasionally speaking, often not, and each morning Zara returned to her room with that second pulse beating a little more loudly than before. The trouble began on the 8th day. Her name was Lyra, and she had been waiting for a moment when there were witnesses. Zara was crossing the inner courtyard with Soren when she heard the voice behind her. Clear, carrying, designed to be heard. The experiment is settling in nicely, I see. She stopped. Soren made a small, pained sound. She turned. Lyra stood with 2 others, arms crossed, copper hair sharp against the gray stone of the courtyard. Her expression was polite in the manner of things that are not polite at all. I don't think we've been formally introduced, Zara said. We haven't. I'm Lyra, beta of this pack. A pause. I've been beta for 6 years. I've managed this territory's daily operations, defended its borders, and kept its people safe through 2 significant external threats. Another pause. I wanted to introduce myself to the Council's newest project. The word project was delivered with precision. Zara held her gaze. That's an impressive record. Thank you for all you've done for this pack. Lyra blinked. That was not the response she'd prepared for. Zara continued. I'm not your enemy. I didn't choose to be here. I made a decision to be here, under circumstances I can't fully explain and wouldn't expect you to understand. I don't want to take anything from you, and I certainly didn't come all this way to fight someone who clearly loves this place. She turned and walked on. Behind her, she heard Soren release a long, shaking breath. That was, he said when he caught up, Either very brave or very stupid. Probably both, she admitted. He heard about it, of course. Nothing in the estate happened without reaching his awareness. She was beginning to understand this, that his quietness was not absence. It was the opposite, the stillness of someone who is tracking everything at once. He found her in the library that evening. He sat across from her, rather than at his usual desk under the window. She noticed this, said nothing. Lyra spoke to you in the courtyard, he said. She introduced herself. Soren gave me a slightly more detailed account. She looked up. I handled it. I know. He was quiet for a moment. She's not a bad person. I know that too. She set her book in her lap. She feels displaced. That's real. I'm not going to punish her for it. He looked at her. That quality of attention again, the one that wasn't calculation, that didn't have a name she could put to it yet. Most people, he said, when they feel threatened, fight back. I've been threatened a lot lately, she said. I've run out of energy for fighting. She meant it as something light, but the moment it was out of her mouth, it had more weight than she intended, and she saw him receive it. Saw the slight shift in his eyes that meant he understood she was talking about more than Lyra. The man, he said carefully. Before. Who was he? She looked at the fire. Someone I thought I knew. What happened? What always happens, she said. I trusted someone who had decided the truth was too complicated to share. A long silence. I understand that, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. His profile was cut sharp by the light, the line of his jaw, the set of his mouth. All of it closed and precise and carrying something that had been sealed away a long time ago and had not, she was beginning to think, ever really stopped hurting. I know, she said quietly. He turned to look at her. I read your file, she said. I know what happened. I know. She paused. I'm sorry. It shouldn't have happened. The silence that followed was very long. Her name was Mara, he said at last. His voice was entirely neutral. The neutrality of something that has been practiced until it becomes automatic. We grew up together. She was, he stopped, started again. She was the kind of person who fills a room without trying to. Loud in the best way. She made everyone feel seen. Zara didn't move. I found out 2 nights before the bonding ceremony. My beta came to me. He'd had suspicions for months. He'd been protecting me. His jaw tightened. I told him he was wrong. I told him to leave. I went to find her myself. She waited. My brother was there, he said. Kieran. He was 3 years younger than me. He had a pause that cost him something visible. He had always wanted what I had. I knew that. I told myself it was just brothers, that it was nothing to worry about, that it was just the way things are when you're in my position. Kale, she said softly. He looked at her. You don't have to. I know. He turned back to the fire. The laws of the pack are clear. What they did together was a betrayal of the bond. It carries a sentence. He paused. I didn't have to be there. The council handles executions. But I chose to be there because I needed to. I needed it to be real. I needed to see it, or I knew some part of me would spend the rest of my life wondering if it had really happened. If there was some explanation I'd missed. Some version of events where I was wrong. She understood this. The terrible logic of it. The need to close the door yourself so it couldn't stay open. I watched them die, he said. And then I became alpha because someone had to, and because there was nothing else left to do. And I decided, he stopped. That love wasn't worth it, she said. He looked at her. Something in his eyes, not agreement exactly. Something more complicated. That the risk wasn't worth it, he said. There's a difference. She held his gaze. Is there? He looked away first. For a man who didn't seem to look away from anything, that was significant. 3 weeks in, she had settled into the estate's rhythms in a way she hadn't expected. The morning walks, the library afternoons, the packed dinners which had shifted slowly, incrementally, from cold assessment to something closer to wary acceptance. Soren had become genuinely fond of her. 2 other young pack members, twins named Daya and Riven, had started appearing wherever she was with the particular determination of people who have decided to adopt someone. She was not happy. She hadn't forgotten what she was doing here or why, or what hung in the balance. But she was, and this was strange, and she acknowledged the strangeness of it, less afraid than she had expected to be. And Kale. Kale was complicated. He was not what the folder had prepared her for. The folder had described a cold, controlled authority figure who had removed himself from emotional life. It had described someone to be managed, approached strategically, eased into connection by careful calibration. It had not described someone who noticed when she was tired and had tea sent to her room without announcing it. It had not described someone who walked past her in the hall and said nothing, but paused, just for a fraction of a second, as though the proximity was something he was making a choice about. It had not described the man who had told her about Mara by the fire, in a voice from which all the performance had been stripped away, and who had afterward spent 3 days avoiding the library with such obvious deliberateness that she couldn't decide whether to be moved or amused. She was, if she was being honest with herself, a little of both. And she was careful, very careful, because the objective was real. She needed him to choose her. Her mother's life depended on it. Her freedom depended on it. And the moment she started feeling something genuine, the moment the edges of what she was doing blurred into what she was feeling, she would lose whatever advantage she had. She told herself this every morning. She told herself this as she walked the garden and heard his footsteps returning from the treeline. She told herself this when he sat across from her in the library and they talked, really talked, about things that had nothing to do with the pack or the contract or either of their histories, about biology, which she knew and he was interested in, about territory management, which he knew and she found herself genuinely curious about the particular loneliness of leadership, about the difference between being responsible for people and being known by them. She told herself she was performing. But the longer she sat in those conversations, the more she was aware that she had long since run out of script. The external threat arrived on the 26th day. It came in the form of a delegation from the Vorin Pack, a northern territory that had been in uneasy alliance with Ashvale for decades. 3 representatives, arriving without prior notice, requesting an audience with the Alpha. Zara heard about it through Soren, who heard about it through Daya, and the information that reached her was patchy and laced with the particular anxiety of pack members who understood that unannounced delegations rarely meant good news. She was in the garden when she felt the shift. Not heard, felt. That new awareness in her, sharpened and strange, felt the change in the estate's energy the way you feel a weather front moving in. Something dense and alert had settled over the pack, and at the center of it was Kale, somewhere inside the main building, dealing with something she wasn't privy to. She didn't go inside. She sat in the garden and waited. He came to find her 2 hours later. His face was closed in a different way from usual. Not the deliberate sealing she'd grown familiar with, but something more volatile underneath. "There's a situation," he said. "I gathered." He sat down on the low stone wall opposite her bench. He looked at the garden without seeing it. "The Vorin Alpha is claiming that the modification procedure used to prepare you violated an old compact between our territories. An agreement about human involvement in pack affairs." She processed this. "Is the claim valid?" "The compact is real. Whether this procedure falls within its terms is..." He paused. "Contested. What does he want?" Kale's jaw tightened. "He says the experiment should be terminated. That you should be returned to your territory and the modification reversed." She went very still. "Can it be reversed?" A pause. Longer than she liked. "Harlan says it would be complicated." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked at him. "And what do you want?" He looked back at her. The garden was quiet. The frost had come in the night and everything had a thin, clean sharpness to it. The air, the light, the lines of his face. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Direct and unsettled. Like someone who has arrived at a question they didn't plan to ask and doesn't know yet what they want the answer to be. "I want..." He stopped. Started again. "I want this handled in a way that doesn't endanger you." She blinked. "The Vorin Alpha's claim," he said. gives him standing to demand your removal. I'm not obligated to agree. But if I refuse outright, it becomes a territorial dispute, and territorial disputes have a way of becoming something else. He looked away. I won't pretend that the reason you're here is entirely your choice or mine. But I will ensure that whatever happens, you are not used as a bargaining piece. Like I was to get here, she said quietly. He flinched. Very small, very controlled. But she saw it. Yes, he said. She looked at the garden, at the frost on the grass, at the bare branches of the apple trees at the far end, patient in their winter emptiness. Then let me be part of the conversation, she said. He looked at her. I'm not going to sit in my room while other people make decisions about my body again, she said. If there's a negotiation to be had, I want to be in the room. She paused. I have a biology degree. I understand the modification procedure better than any of your counsel will. And she stopped, considered. I am someone who can think clearly under pressure. Let me be useful. He was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. The meeting was the following morning. She sat at the long council table and watched the Voron delegation across from her and felt, for the first time since arriving on the estate, entirely certain of what she was. Not a project, not a contract, not an experiment. A person who had made a choice, an imperfect, coerced, complicated choice, and who was going to own it. The Voron Alpha was a broad man with pale eyes and the particular arrogance of someone accustomed to getting what he demanded. His name was Declan. He looked at her once, assessingly, and then addressed himself exclusively to Kale, which told her everything she needed to know about him. She let Kale open, watched the legal back and forth over the compact's terms, waited. Then, when Declan said, with the kind of calm certainty that expects no rebuttal, "The human has no say in pack law," she spoke. "The human," she said very clearly, "is the only person in this room who has first-hand knowledge of the modification procedure, which means I'm also the only person who can tell you whether it falls within the compact's prohibition on unsanctioned human alteration." Declan looked at her properly for the first time. She continued, "The compact uses the language of permanent alteration. The procedure I underwent is adaptive. It is responsive to my biology, not overriding it. By the compact's own language, it falls outside the prohibition." She paused. "I can provide documentation, if you'd like to review it." Silence. Kale was very still beside her. Declan's pale eyes were calculating. "That interpretation is correct," said Elder Seraphine from the far end of the table, with the serenity of someone who has just watched a chess piece move precisely where it was needed. The delegation withdrew for private consultation. In the corridor outside the council chamber, Kale looked at her. She looked back at him. "Where did you get that interpretation?" he asked. "I read the compact last night. Soren found it in the archive for me." She paused. "The language really does support it. I wasn't making it up." "I know," he said. His voice was different, rougher at the edges. "That's not." He stopped. She waited, surprised her. The way it came out, genuine and uncalculated. The first real laugh she'd managed in longer than she could pinpoint. It also, she realized later, surprised him. He was crossing the garden with his council files when it happened. He stopped. Not for long, barely a beat. But she saw him pause with his head slightly turned in the direction the sound had come from, the way you turn toward something you weren't expecting. And then he walked on. But the files, she noticed, were held a little looser than before. It was Soren who told her about the anniversary. He mentioned it in the careful, indirect way of someone conveying something important while maintaining plausible deniability. She was asking, casually, why the estate felt different that week. Quieter, the pack's energy more subdued. "This time of year," Soren said, studying the middle distance, it's the anniversary of what happened. He stopped. "You know." She did know. She spent that evening in the library alone. Not reading, thinking. She thought about what it meant to carry an anniversary in your body the way some people carry weather. The way grief doesn't respect the passage of time. How it sits, quiet and heavy. and then arrives on a specific date with the original weight of it restored in full. She thought about the fact that he was somewhere in this building, dealing with that, alone, the way he dealt with everything. She didn't go looking for him. Instead, she wrote. She had found a notebook in the library, blank, good paper, and had started using it without really deciding to. Observations. Thoughts that didn't have anywhere else to go. The particular way Frost looked on the iron of the garden gate at 7 in the morning. The sound the fire made in the library when the logs settled. The way the pack moved through their lives here with an easiness that she had slowly stopped finding foreign. She wrote about Kale. She wrote about it carefully, the way you handle something fragile, the way you write about something you're not ready to name yet. She wrote about the 3 seconds in the doorway on the first night, about the library, about the corridor after the council meeting, about the way he had paused when she laughed. She read it back. She closed the notebook. She pressed her hand against the second pulse in her chest and sat with what she knew. He found her in the library at midnight. She had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire. She hadn't planned to, but the warmth and the quiet had done what they always did, and the notebook had slid from her lap, and she had woken to the sound of the door. He stood in the entrance, still in the dark clothes of his day, with the particular disarray of someone who had been sitting awake for too long. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible to anyone who hadn't been learning to read him, but she had been, and she could see it in the set of his shoulders and the slight distance in his eyes that meant he was still partly somewhere else. He saw that she was awake. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't. It's fine." She sat up. "Do you want me to leave?" A pause. The kind that means no but takes longer to say than that. "No," he said. He came in. He didn't sit at his desk. He sat in the chair on the other side of the fireplace, close in the way that two people are close when they've stopped calculating the distance, and he looked at the fire. She waited. "I keep thinking," he said after a while, "about whether I made the right choice. That night." He paused. Not the sentence. The sentence was law. But being there, watching. He looked at the fire with an expression that was very tired. "I thought it would give me certainty. But what it gave me was, I just kept seeing her face. Before." He stopped. "She was sorry. I could see it. Whether she was sorry because she loved me or sorry because she was afraid, I don't know. I never will know. And some days that's the thing that—" He stopped again. "That keeps you up," she said. "Yes." She shifted in her chair, tucked her feet beneath her. "Can I ask you something?" She had never been to the training yard. It was in the southern part of the estate, bordered by high stone walls, and it was a space that felt unmistakably like his. The same clean efficiency she recognized from everything he touched, implements maintained with care, the ground worn smooth by years of use. He was sparring with Lyra. She watched from the wall. It was extraordinary. Not just the physical dimension of it, the speed, the precision, the way both of them moved with the economical grace of bodies that had been doing this since childhood. It was the conversation happening beneath the movement. She could see it, the push and pull of two people who knew each other completely, who had been through things together that had forged the kind of trust that doesn't require words. Whatever history existed between Kale and Lyra, whatever hurt and resentment the beta carried, it was also true that she would walk through fire for him. It was written in how she moved, in how she held his eye, in the hard edge of care underneath the competition. When they finished, Lyra saw Zara at the wall. Their gazes met. Something in Lyra's expression, not warmth, not yet, but a shift, an adjustment, the kind of recalibration that happens when you've assigned someone to a category and then seen something that doesn't fit. She walked away without speaking. Kale came over to the wall. He was breathing harder than usual. The control of him was loosened by exertion in a way she had only seen before on the morning runs. The version of him that was less constructed, less deliberate. He looked at her with that slight question in his expression. "You came to find me," he said. "I wanted to ask you something." He waited. "Do you think," she said carefully, "that what the council did, arranging this, setting up the contract, do you think they knew what it would actually become?" He was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean?" I mean, they designed it around the idea that you wouldn't choose freely unless you were maneuvered into proximity with someone compatible. They were thinking about biology, about lineage. She paused. But do you think any of them thought about what it would feel like? For either of us. He held her gaze. No, he said. I don't think they thought about that. Me neither. She looked at the training yard. They thought they were solving a logistics problem. Yes. But it's not a logistics problem. No, he said. His voice was different now. Quieter. Closer to something honest and raw. It isn't. She looked at him. He looked at her. Zara, he said. Her name, in his voice with that particular weight he gave it. The weight of someone who says a name because they've been thinking it for longer than they're prepared to admit. I know, she said softly. I don't, he stopped. His jaw worked. I don't know how to do this. I thought I'd burned all of this out of myself. I thought I'd made it, so there was nothing left to. Cale, she said. He stopped. You didn't burn it out, she said. You just buried it. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, like someone making a choice that they know will change everything, he reached out and touched her face. Just that. His hand against her cheek. Gentle in the way that enormous things can be gentle when they're trying very hard. She felt it everywhere. Not just in her skin. In that second pulse. In the marrow of whatever she had become on the table in the white room. She didn't move. Neither did he. They stood in the training yard with the cold air and the stone walls and the last of the afternoon light going gold and thin around them. And she thought, this is the moment. This is the moment the folder was trying to engineer and couldn't. Because no one engineered this. This was two broken things finding the same frequency. It almost fell apart the following week. It was Lyra who showed her the letter, not maliciously, to her credit. Lyra who came to her room at night with something in her expression that had moved past competition into something more complicated. You should see this, she said. The letter was from Harlan. It was addressed to the council. It had been written 2 weeks before Zara arrived on the estate. It outlined the full plan. Not just the medical elements, the social strategy too. The recommendation that Zara be given access to the library, knowing it was Cale's preferred space. The suggestion of the morning timing, knowing his running routine. The note, clinical and deliberate, that the subject presents high emotional intelligence and adaptive communication skills, and would likely develop authentic connection with the alpha, provided proximity was sufficiently managed. She was a study. She had been, from before she arrived, a designed experiment. Even her own feelings, the authenticity she had been clinging to, the distinction she had drawn between what she'd started doing and what she'd ended up feeling, had been predicted, had been part of the design. She set the letter down. She sat on the edge of her bed. Lyra stood by the door. I thought you deserved to know, she said. I thought, if it were me, I'd want to know. Thank you, Zara said. Lyra left. Zara sat alone for a long time. The second pulse beat. Steady. Unchanged. Unhelpfully indifferent to the question of whether everything she had built over the past weeks was real or manufactured. She thought, does it matter? She thought, yes, it matters. She thought, but what exactly matters? Whether my feelings were induced, or whether they are real now regardless of how they started. She thought about her biology degree, about the fact that every feeling a human being has is, on some level, chemistry. On some level, the result of conditions. That the gap between I felt this because I was designed to feel it, and I felt this because I was a person in circumstances that produced it was, philosophically, frustratingly, not as clean as she wanted it to be. She thought about Cale's hand against her face. She thought, that was real. Whatever the letter says, whatever Harlan planned, that moment was not planned. That was a man making a choice he'd been refusing to make for 8 years. She picked up the letter. She stood up. She went to find him. He was in the library. Of course he was. Where else? He looked up when she came in. Saw her face. Was on his feet before she said a word. She handed him the letter. She watched him read it. The expression on his face was She had never seen this from him. The control didn't slip. The control was simply not sufficient for what he was reading. It showed in the set of his shoulders, in the hard line of his mouth, in the way his eyes moved through the page with the particular devastation of someone reading something they had, in some private part of themselves, already suspected. He set the letter down. "How long have you had this?" he asked. 20 minutes. "You came straight to me." "Yes." He looked at her. "Why?" She held his gaze. "Because the alternative was staying in my room and letting it become something that sat between us. And I don't." She paused. "I didn't want that." He was quiet. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking," he said with great care, "that everything I know about you tells me that what happened between us was not manufactured. That you are not performing." He paused. "And I'm also thinking that I have believed things before that turned out not to be true. And I don't know." He stopped. "You don't know if you can trust your own judgment," she said. He looked at her with something raw and honest in his eyes. "Yes." She crossed the room. She stood close to him, close enough that she could feel that second pulse responding to his proximity, the specific resonance of it, the thing that had been happening since the very first night and that she had stopped trying to explain or rationalize. "I can't prove it to you," she said. "I can't give you certainty. I know that's what you want. I know certainty is the thing you decided was the price of being safe. But I don't have it to give." She paused. "What I can tell you is that I came here for my mother. I stayed because I had no choice. But the reason I'm standing here right now in front of you is because I want to be here. Not the contract. Not Harlan. Me." He looked at her. He looked at her for a very long time. And then he said, "I know. Just that. I know." And she believed him. It was Soren who found her 3 days later, early morning, white-faced and running. "There's been an incursion," he said, breathless. "Eastern border. Voron scouts, they breached the perimeter. There's been a confrontation. The Alpha is..." He stopped. Swallowed. "He went out himself." She was moving before he finished the sentence. She didn't have the speed the pack had. She didn't have the ability to shift. But the modification had given her something. A heightened awareness, a directional sense she'd been quietly learning to trust. A kind of pull that oriented her like a compass. She followed it through the forest. She found them in a clearing 200 meters past the eastern treeline. It was already over. The scouts had retreated or been driven back. The pack members present were tending to 2 injured young fighters. Lyra was standing with her hand pressed to a cut on her forehead, talking rapidly to someone. Kale was at the edge of the clearing. He was on one knee in the wet leaves. His left side was wrong, held too carefully, the shoulder braced at an angle that meant injury. His face was turned away from her. She crossed the clearing. She knelt in front of him. He looked up. There was blood, not a large amount but enough. A cut along his jaw. His eyes were slightly unfocused, which scared her in a way she didn't want to look at directly. "How bad?" she asked. "I've had worse." "That's not an answer." Something crossed his face. A ghost of something. A rib. Maybe 2. And the shoulder is dislocated. She looked at his shoulder. Assessed it. Looked back at his face. "This is going to hurt," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his eyes. A kind of recognition, a kind of trust. "I know." She set his shoulder. He made no sound. Not one. The only evidence was the whitening of his knuckles and the sharp exhale through his nose. When it was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen from him. Not the contained assessment. Not the careful neutrality. Not even the tentative, frightening openness of the library by the fire. This was something else. This was the expression of a person who has been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting, and has just, in the clearing of a winter forest with blood on his face and cold mud on both their knees, finally understood what they were waiting for. "Zara," he said. "Don't," she said. Her voice was unsteady in a way she usually didn't allow. "Not yet. Wait until you don't have 2 broken ribs." He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had ever heard from him. She helped him to his feet. She kept her hand in his the whole way back. We are almost at the end of this story, and I need you to stay with me, because what comes next is the moment everything becomes real. But before we get there, please share this video. Send it to someone who needs to be reminded that healing is possible. That the right person doesn't fix you, but they make you brave enough to fix yourself. Comment below, what moment in this story hit you the hardest? I read everyone. And if you've been here from the beginning and you haven't subscribed yet, you've earned it. Hit that button. Now let's finish this. He healed fast, Pack Biology, but she went to him every morning for the 3 days of his recovery. Not because anyone asked her to. Not because it was part of any plan. She went because she wanted to. She sat on the chair by his bed and they talked. The way they had been talking for weeks now, but without the public space of the library or the estate's corridors, without the awareness of being observed and assessed. Just the two of them and the winter light through the tall windows and the fire and the particular ease of people who have decided to stop performing for each other. He told her things. He told her about Kieran, his brother, not the betrayal that she knew but the before. The years before. The boy who had followed him everywhere as a child. Who had been funny in a way Cale himself had never managed to be. Who had loved music and hated mornings and had once, on a bet, tried to cook an entire packed dinner and set 2 things on fire. She told him about her mother's hands. About Gerald the plant, who was apparently still alive, per Amara's report. About the specific loneliness of being the responsible one in your family, the one everyone expects to manage, the one who learned early to hold things together and forgot, somewhere along the way, to let anyone else hold things together for her. You've been holding things together since you got here, he said. Someone had to. No, he said. You didn't have to. You chose to. He paused. There's a difference. You told me that, I think. She smiled. I did. He looked at her with that expression. The one she had no name for yet. The one that was still finding its way out of wherever it had been sealed for 8 years. I chose you, he said, quietly, like a statement of fact. Like something he had turned over and examined from every angle and arrived at with the specific certainty of someone who has stopped fighting the truth. I know the contract exists, he said. I know what it says. I know the council thinks they arranged this. I know Harlan thinks he engineered it. He held her gaze. None of that is why. I choose you because you came to find me in that clearing and knelt in the mud and set my shoulder back without flinching. Because you stood in a council meeting and quoted Pack law to a man twice your size. Because you talked to me about Kieran. He paused. Because you didn't let me stay buried. She looked at him. Her eyes were full. She was not going to cry, she was absolutely not going to cry, and then she was a little, because some things are bigger than the decision not to be moved by them. I need to tell you something, she said. Tell me. I came here for my mother. That was the real reason. Not the contract. Well, the contract was a means to the real reason. My mother is ill. This was the only way. She paused. And for the first few weeks I was managing this. Intentionally. Strategically. I knew what the contract needed and I was trying to. She stopped. Made herself look at him directly. I want you to know that. I want you to know the whole of it. Because I don't want there to be anything between us that I chose to leave out. He was very still. When did it stop being strategy? He asked. She thought about it honestly. The night you told me about Mara. By the fire. She paused. I stopped managing it and started just being in it. Because you were real. You were so real. And I couldn't. She stopped. I couldn't keep pretending to be something less real in response. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was large and warm and held hers with the same quality of gentleness that she had felt in the training yard. Something enormous learning to be careful. Your mother, he said. Her treatment. I meant what I said, it's been transferred. It's not dependent on the contract's completion. It won't be reversed. She looked at him. Whatever happens between us, he said. Your mother's care is not a condition. It's just done. He paused. And the contract's terms about you leaving after. He stopped. Something crossed his face. You don't have to go. If you don't want to. He looked at her. I'm not asking you to stay because of an heir. I'm asking you. He stopped again. Cale, she said softly. I'm asking you to stay, he said, because I haven't wanted anything for 8 years, and I want this. She looked at their joined hands. She thought about the folder, about Harlan's calculated pairings and Seraphine's measuring looks and Lyra's initial coldness, about the procedure in the White Room and the drive through the dark forest and the moment she stepped out of the car and felt the second pulse in her chest quicken for the first time. She thought about how many people had tried to control this, to engineer it, to manage it toward a predetermined outcome. And she thought about how completely, magnificently it had escaped all of them. I want to meet your pack properly, she said. Not as an experiment, not as a candidate, just as someone who is here because she wants to be. He looked at her. Is that a yes? He said. She squeezed his hand. That's a yes. Spring came to the estate. It came slowly, the way things do when they've been a long time buried. A green shoot here, a pale flower there, the mornings edging lighter and warmer in increments so small you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. She was paying attention. She had become, in her months here, someone different from the woman who had stood in a doorway holding a bag of takeout and watched something end. Not unrecognizable. She was still Zara, still the girl who talked to plants and made chai from scratch and held things together, but larger somehow. Settled into herself in a new way. The pack had settled around her too. Lyra had come to her, quietly one evening, and said simply, I misjudged you. Nothing more. Nothing less. From Lyra, Zara understood this was a significant statement, and she received it as such. Daya and Riven had appointed themselves her unofficial protectors and constant companions, a role they performed with such cheerful determination that she had stopped trying to discourage it. Soren had given her, on the morning of her 3-month mark, a small frame drawing he'd done of the Eastern Garden, the one she walked every morning, the one that had become, without any announcement, the space where things between her and Kale had found their footing. She kept it on the writing desk next to Gerald too. A plant Kale had sourced from somewhere, presented without ceremony, set on her desk one morning while she was at breakfast, with only a note that said, I was told you might be missing this. She had kept the note. They walked the garden in the early spring morning, frost finally gone, and the air had that particular smell of things beginning. Wet earth and new growth and the forest exhaling after its long-held breath of winter. She had told him 2 weeks ago about the pregnancy. Quietly, privately, just the two of them in the library, the way the important things between them had always happened. His face had been, she would remember it always. The emotion on it was not the reaction of a man who had been given what the contract required. It was the face of someone who had been handed something they had stopped believing was possible and didn't yet know how to hold it without fear. He had sat with it for a long moment. Then he had looked at her and said, Are you? I'm okay, she said. I'm good. I am actually good. He had reached for her hand, and held it for a very long time. Now, in the spring garden, she walked beside him. His shoulder brushed hers, the easy, unselfconscious contact of people who have stopped calculating the distance between them. Seraphine wants a formal ceremony, he said. For the bonding. I know. She mentioned it 4 times yesterday. She mentioned it to me 6 times. A pause, and she heard the ghost of that laugh again. The one she had been collecting, the ones that came out quietly, unexpectedly, like light through a crack. I told her we'd discuss it. And will we? He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to face her, and she looked up at him in the spring light. This man who had buried himself so carefully, who had built such perfect walls, who had looked at her on the first night with 3 seconds of unreadable expression and had been, she now understood, already losing the fight. I think, he said, that the formal ceremony is probably necessary for the pack. He paused. But I want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, the choice was made a long time ago. Before the ceremony. Before the air. He looked at her. The choice was made in the library and in the training yard and in the winter forest. It was made every morning in the garden. He paused. It was made the moment you walked into a council meeting you had no obligation to be in and quoted pack law better than my own counsel. She looked at him. I choose you, Zara Adeyemi, he said. Not because the contract said to. Not because the council required it. Because you are, he paused. let out a slow breath. You are the bravest person I have ever met. And I spent 8 years trying to stop feeling anything. And you spent 6 weeks making that completely impossible. And I am... His voice was rough now, honest in the way of someone who has stopped managing what they let out. I am grateful that you were brought here, that you chose to stay, that you refused to be less than exactly who you are. She was definitely crying now. She didn't bother pretending otherwise. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his chest and felt his arms come around her. Strong and careful, the way they always were, enormous things learning to be gentle, and she felt that second pulse beating against his heartbeat, the two of them finding their rhythm together. I choose you too, she said against his chest. For the record. She felt him exhale, long and deep and slow, like someone putting down something very heavy. For the record, he said, and she could hear, in his voice, that ghost of a smile. She wrote to Amara that night. You were right, she wrote. Stop managing it and just be in it. Sometimes the contracts we agree to aren't about what we think they're about. Sometimes the thing you do to survive becomes the thing that changes your life. Sometimes the person you were supposed to trick into loving you turns out to be the one who makes you understand what love without fear looks like. He fell, she wrote. Slowly, against his own will, trying the whole time not to. And I fell too. The same way. Loudly on the inside and quietly on the outside and trying the whole time to call it something else. I think that's how the best things happen. Not suddenly. Not perfectly. But so completely that by the time you admit it, there's nothing left to resist. She sealed the letter. Outside the window, the Pax territory spread into the dark forest, old and alive and full of things she was still learning. The estate was quiet, the way it was quiet in the late evenings. A full, living silence, the silence of a place that held many people and their many ongoing stories. The second pulse beat. Patient. Warm. Sure. She pressed her hand against it. Yeah, she thought. Me too. And that's where we leave them. Not at an ending, because this isn't the kind of story that ends. This is the kind of story that becomes a life. Two people who were broken in different ways, placed in proximity by forces that thought they understood what they were doing, and who promptly escaped every plan ever made for them and found their way to something real. Zara, who survived betrayal and impossible choices and a white room and a winter forest and came out the other side not healed. Never fully healed. Healing is not a destination, but more herself than she had ever been. Braver. Warmer. Known. Kale, who spent 8 years being very good at being alpha and very bad at being a person, and who was completely undone by a woman who refused to be less than herself, who quoted Pack law in his council meeting, who knelt in the mud of a winter clearing and set his shoulder without flinching, who told him the full truth even when the full truth was complicated, who fell for him on her own terms and waited for him to catch up. The contract was never what made them. What made them was every small, unscheduled, unplanned moment in between. That's how love works, when it's real. Not by design. By choice. Again and again. Every morning in the garden. Every evening in the library. Every time two broken people decide, separately and together, that the risk is worth it. That the risk has always been worth it. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. If you felt something, if Zara's resilience hit you, if Kale's slow, reluctant falling got under your skin, if any part of this reminded you of your own story, then this video did what it was supposed to do. Please share it. Right now. Someone in your life needs this story today. Drop a comment below. Tell me who you are and where you're watching from, or just tell me. Did he deserve her? I want to know what you think. And if you've been here for any part of this journey and you haven't subscribed yet, come on. You know you belong here. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next story. Because there's always another one, and they're always worth it.